Okay, yeah, my name's Tristan Goulden. I'm the science lead for the remote sensing team at the National Ecological Observatory Network, which is a project sponsored by National Science Foundation and operated by Battelle. And today I'm going to provide an overview of NEON's AOP, or Airborne Observation Platform, that we use for ecosystem mapping. So just as a high-level overview for folks that may not be familiar with the AOP, we're collecting airborne remote sensing data, and generally we're trying to cover regional scales of a minimum of 100 kilometers squared. Using this data, we're generating data products at what we consider to be a high spatial mapping resolution of less than or equal to a meter squared. And the sensors that we use are a waveform LiDAR, imaging spectrometer, and high-resolution RGB camera. So for anyone out there that's not familiar with NEON, this is essentially the network. We've divided the continental US, Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico into 20 unique ecoclimatic domains. And inside of each one of those domains, there's been sites selected that are representative of the unique ecology and climate conditions within that larger domain. And then at each one of these sites, we do a series of intensive sampling. And currently the project has just sort of entered initial operations and planning for this sampling to continue for the next 30 years. This schematic shows a summary of the type of sampling that would occur on a NEON site. One of the most notable pieces of infrastructure we have is our flux towers, which you'd see on the left. And so these are doing atmospheric measurements, gas exchange, and meteorological measurements. We also have in situ soil sensors, aquatic sensors that are measuring water quantity and water quality, as well as a series of field staff that are collecting information about vegetation, small mammals, and insects. And of course, we also have the Airborne Remote Sensing Platform, which you see in the top center, which is doing mapping, which maps the regions where all of these different sampling activities are taking place. So this is the payload we have on our aircraft. And so on the left, you see the NEON imaging spectrometer. And so that's an imaging spectrometer that was custom built for the project by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And then on the right, you can see just a little bit of green there. That's our LiDAR and camera system. So just a little bit more details about those sensors. We have a full waveform LiDAR sensor. This is considered an active remote sensing instrument because it produces its own energy source. And so essentially, the LiDAR is a laser that's generated at the aircraft and directed towards the ground. We measure the two-way travel time for that laser to reach objects on the ground and return to the aircraft. And from that, we can calculate a range. That range information included with the position and orientation of the aircraft and the direction of that laser pulse allows us to coordinate all points that that the laser intercepts on the ground. And so something special about these lasers is that they're capable of transmitting pulses at really high speeds. And so right now we've got a sensor that's capable of going up to 1,000 kilohertz. And so that's 1 million laser pulses per second. That allows you to get a really dense three-dimensional representation of the terrain. The laser pulses are also capable of recording multiple returns. And so when the laser interacts with an object like vegetation, we can get a reflection off the top of the vegetation. And then some of that energy will continue down onto objects below, such as understory or the ground. And we can get returns off of those objects and then identify which returns are coming from the top of objects, like the top of the canopy or the ground. And then we have the imaging spectrometer. And so this observes data in a push-boom configuration. This is an optical passive sensor as opposed to the active sensor of the LiDAR. And so we're just measuring reflected solar energy. As the aircraft is flying forward, we're measuring about 34 degrees across track and imaging areas about 1 milliradian, which at our altitude of 1,000 meters is about 1 meter squared on the ground. And so each one of these observations is separated into different wavelength components between 380 and 2510 nanometers. So that's the visible portion of the spectrum through to shortwave infrared. We divide that section of the spectrum into 5 nanometer bands, and so that gives us just over 400 different bands of information in that wavelength region. And so what we're really after here from the imaging spectrometer is that surface reflectance. And so it's the strength of reflected energy of objects on the ground. And so that gives us sort of this unique signature of the molecular composition of those objects that interacts with the solar energy. And then we have our just a high resolution RGB camera. And so this is just visible information, but it's at a much higher resolution than the LiDAR or the imaging spectrometer, giving about 5 to 10 centimeters of resolution. And so provides additional contextual information on objects that may not be identifiable with the other sensors. And so really, we've chosen these sensors for ecosystem mapping, primarily the LiDAR and the hyperspectral imaging spectrometer, because they're synergistic tools for studying ecosystems. The imaging spectrometer, because of its ability to identify chemical composition of the objects that it's observing, allows us to identify vegetation health or vegetation type, where the LiDAR gives us that three-dimensional structure of the surface topography and the canopy structure. And so obviously over the 30-year period of the observatory, we're going to be looking at these sensors to provide us metrics on how these ecosystems are changing over that period of time. This map shows collections that we did from 2013 to 2020. So how many times we visited the sites in each one of the domains. And so you can see that some of the domains we visited up to 5 times. And the sort of disparate nature of how many times we've collected domains was really just a result of domains that we were able to do early on in the observatory when we were still building out and testing the equipment. We just do 2 or 3 a year. But moving forward, we'll kind of see a more even distribution of the domains that we're doing from year to year. This is an example of the 2021 schedule that we followed this year, and we're just wrapping up right now. Our second plane is down in D3 in Florida and just finishing up the season in the next couple of days. And so all the dark green domains are what we collected this year, and this sort of represents a more typical year of collections where we'd collect at somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the domains in the observatory. So a few of our collection requirements, generally we're trying to collect under completely clear skies. If there's any cloud cover, it really affects the quality of the imaging spectrometer observations. As I mentioned, we're trying to fly at about 1,000 meters, and so that we can get that 1 meter resolution in the LiDAR and the spectrometer, which allows us to identify any objects that are that size. We're typically flying at a minimum a 10 by 10 kilometer box, and that's because we want to cover a regional area that includes all of the other sampling activities by NEON and also includes local areas around those sampling regions. And then we also fly at peak greenness, and so that's when all the vegetation is experiencing its peak photosynthetic capacity. So we've done a long-term analysis of when that period of the year is at each one of our domains and try to schedule our collections during that period. And it's really to control for changes in phenology in the vegetation from year to year. We always want to hit it at that peak greenness time to allow us to do the best possible comparisons between annual collections. And then typically we'll also fly our lines in a north-south direction, and when the sun is at least 40 degrees above the horizon, and that's just to give us the highest quality data. So an example of how we might fly a site in the observatory. So I'm focusing on Harvard Forest, which is in D1, the northeast portion of the continental US. So this image shows the white line is the outline of where sampling activities may be occurring, and the red dot identifies where that flux tower is. And so typically we'd never have an edge of our 10 by 10 kilometer box less than 2 kilometers from the tower. And then we always would want to capture the predominant airshed of the tower as well. In this case, a 10 by 10 kilometer box wouldn't cover the entire sampling area. And so we'd extend that box out to cover all of those areas. And then we'd put down flight lines, and then essentially the aircraft would follow these north-south flight lines in a continuous manner either from east to west or west to east until we've got the entire area covered. You can think about it mowing the lawn. The aircraft covers an area of about 600 meters across each time it does a line. And so as we fly each of these lines, we'll get complete coverage of the area in the box. This is an example of our data lifecycle. Essentially, the aircraft collects the data, as I mentioned, and then we send that to what we call a hotel kit, which is a computer that travels with the aircraft and does quality checks on the data immediately after it's collected. We then actually ship the data by hard drive back to our archiving center in Denver. We'll archive the data, and then scientists at our headquarters will pull the data from that archiving center and then transition it into a series of data products. So we'll run the algorithms to create the data products as well as do some quality control. Once that's finished, the data will be uploaded back to our archiving center and then made available for anyone to download through our data portal. These are the data products that the remote sensing group produces. They're divided into a series of levels, level 1 through 3, where level 1 is the rawest form of data that we provide, and then level 2 and level 3 have some additional processing provided. And so generally what you see in level 2 is vegetation or water indexes derived from the spectrometer. And then you see a lot of those repeated in level 3, and that's because the difference between level 2 and level 3 is that at level 2, we're providing the data in the flight lines as flown by the aircraft. But when we get to level 3, we've mosaicked all of those flight lines and divided them into a series of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer tiles. And so then you can just download a tile of interest that may cover an area that you're studying as opposed to the entire flight line. And so level 3 has all of those spectrometer products you see in level 2, as well as LiDAR products. And I've highlighted some products in red right now because we've temporarily suspended those while we retool and improve the algorithms for those data products. So this is an example of some data that we collected. This is a point cloud generated from the LiDAR. This is from a site in the Pacific Northwest. So some pretty tall trees, some of the tallest trees in our observatory. These ones are close to 50 meters tall. If I zoom in on one section, you can see that this image is made up of a series of points, and these are all reflected returns that have been recorded by the LiDAR sensor. And then of course, along with this, we've got those spectral signatures from the spectrometer. What I've shown here is a typical spectral signature from photosynthetically active vegetation. This area over on the left is the visible portion, so what our eyes are able to interpret, and then the rest of that spectral curve goes through the near infrared, shortwave infrared portion of the spectrum. And obviously, you can see in that area there's a lot of information contained that helps us identify the health and identification of tree species. Actively photosynthetically active vegetation typically has that large jump in the near infrared region of the spectrum that you see just to the right of the visible portion of the spectrum. So just another quick example of the benefits of the spectrometer information. You can see on the left is an RGB, just a regular red, green, blue image, and on the right, a false color image. And so we've taken that near infrared band that we get those really strong returns in the near infrared band from photosynthetically active vegetation. If I zoom in into the same region of these images, you can really see your ability to discriminate between the different trees in the image. And you can see that some of those trees are showing that really bright red. And so that's showing really strong reflections in the near infrared, as opposed to some of the other trees are maybe a little bit pinkish or blue. And it really shows you that there's a lot of difference happening between these trees just in the local vicinity to one another, and sort of demonstrates the capability of the spectrometer to identify different processes that might be occurring with these different individuals. This is an example of our digital surface model, which is a product from our LiDAR sensor. This shows a complete landscape of a site that we collected in, again, on the West Coast. The textural information that you see here is basically the top of the tree canopy. So this is a surface model created using all the points that the LiDAR collected. And as I mentioned before, the LiDAR has the ability to collect multiple returns. And so we get those returns off the top of the canopy, and then we can get returns off the understory and the ground. And we're able to identify which points came from the top of the canopy and which ones came from the ground. And then we're able to strip off all of those points that came from the vegetation and see just what the terrain looks like underneath the vegetation. And from that, we're able to calculate what we call a canopy height model, which is essentially the height of the trees across the landscape. And so this shows basically the difference between that digital surface model and the digital terrain model. Just another example of what we can do with the imaging spectrometer. On the left, I have a map of NDVI, which stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It's one of the indexes that we generate as a level 2 and level 3 product from the spectrometer. This particular acquisition was over an area that had recently experienced a wildfire. And so the really bright areas are showing really high values of NDVI. And so that's where the vegetation is really photosynthetically active. And then those purple areas are darker areas where you can see that those trees are not as photosynthetically active because they've been affected by the wildfire. And then on the right, you can see just an RGB image of the same area where you can tell from that spectrometer, you can really easily identify the areas that have been affected by the wildfire. Okay, I just wanted to highlight some recent research that's been that has utilized the data that we've collected from the AOP. And so this is a paper, Wang et al. From University of Wisconsin-Madison, where they've collected or generated a series of plant traits using the imaging spectrometer information. And so field data was collected that field data of foliar samples was collected and then sent for chemical analysis throughout areas that were captured by the AOP, and then machine learning algorithms were used to relate those field measurements to the spectrometer measurements and then expanded across the entire area that was covered by the AOP. And so you can see they're able to generate information about a series of plant traits across the entire region that we flew. This was a study that looked at identifying individual tree species from our data. So again, a series of individual trees are identified in the imagery, in the AOP imagery. Which species each one of those trees was also identified along with their location. And then deep learning technique was used to then predict what the rest of the tree species are throughout the entire AOP acquisition. And we've also had some folks at University of Florida looking at identifying individual tree crowns in our imagery. So again, using computer vision type techniques to identify all the individual tree crowns. And this enables sort of an accounting of all the different individual trees across an entire site that's flown with the AOP. Okay, and so AOP is also available as an assignable asset. So if researchers are interested in using our Airborne platform to fly their site of interest, we have an asset available for doing that as part of grant activities. And so you know, the asset can be requested, and then we can fly different sites that you may be interested in for your own research purposes. We recently did one of these acquisitions at the Crested Butte area in Colorado, and this represents the first publication that was generated from one of those assignable asset flights. And then if you're interested in looking at any of our data products, you can go to Neon's data portal at data.neonscience.org. And from there, you can download any of the data that I've mentioned here today, and then as well as any of the data that's collected by any of the other instruments that exist at the Neon sites throughout the observatory. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Goulden. That was a really amazing presentation. I want to remind people that they can go ahead and put questions in the chat or on Discord, and we will try to get to them. Oh boy, sorry. I had a question and it totally just blanked from my mind. Do you expect to fly over these sites again in the future?
Yeah, and so we'll fly over, you know, 2/3 to 3/4 of the domains on an annual basis. And so, you know, by the end of the 30-year period of the observatory, we'll probably have covered each of the sites in the domains, you know, between 20 or 25 times.
Awesome. Is Neon at all looking to expand beyond the United States?
Yeah, not right now. No, I mean, I think it's a fairly large project, and so I think that, you know, at this point, a couple of years ago, the observatory finished the construction phase, and so we're sort of done with that expansion and building out of the observatory, and now it's moved into its operational phase where we'll be operating at each of the sites that we've established already for the timeline of the observatory.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like a massive amount of work went into all of this. I can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's great to see some steady stream of data products coming through our data portal now from all the different sites and observation systems that we have.
Absolutely. Because I'm kind of a data nerd. About how much data do you have routinely coming in?
Yeah, so I can't speak for the whole observatory, you know, because I'm more familiar with the remote sensing data, although the remote sensing data is the vast majority of the data volume. We sort of represent a lower number of total data products. There's 28 different AOP data products. You know, there's well over 100 data products across the whole observatory, but the volume of data that we collect is quite high. And so I think that we are sitting on probably 0.5 petabyte or so of data now.
Wow.
We probably collect 100 to 150 terabytes of data a year. Something.
Wow. Yeah, that's an impressive amount.
Yeah, it's a lot of data.
Absolutely. Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions, but lots of thanks and praise for a great presentation. Really appreciate you being able to join us this morning.
Awesome, thank you.